Hello, everyone, and welcome to Orthodox Shahada. I'm here today with Shaykh Asrar Rashid. A really great treat for you. We're going to basically learn Kalam from a traditional scholar, but we're going to do it by focusing on this book called Islam Answers Atheism, which he very kindly sent to me for free. I did a review of it as well on Amazon. And it's a really great book. I think it's the first of its kind, isn't it, Sheikh? There's no other book like this that really kind of addresses atheism from a traditional Sunni scholar that I'm aware of.
Well, I'm going to leave the judgment to yourself and the readers, inshallah. So,
Excellent.
coming from a Christian, it would be totally unbiased. What you've just
Yeah,
said.
I'm going to just give a brief introduction of you if you want to add anything. So Sheikh Asrar is a scholar and he currently lives in Birmingham in the UK. He began his studies in Birmingham and later moved to Syria to study at Damascus University, the Grand Ummayad Mosque, and then Masjid Muhayyuddin. Shaykh Asrar is a teacher of Islamic Studies, but he continues to further pursue his knowledge on Islamic Fiqh, Aqeedah, and other contemporary issues. He enjoys studying and teaching issues pertaining to Kalam, eschatology, and other social political issues. And he's already done actually two interviews with, he's done an interview and a debate with Jay. And so the political issues he covers with Jay, a lot of his views in the geopolitics interview. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that?
No, that's sufficient, I suppose.
Great. So I think we're mainly going to cover the first four chapters of the book because they concern epistemology and theology. The last three, I think, are kind of about hadith issues and Quranic textual issues and Islam and science and those kinds of questions. But I think for this interview, I want to focus on those chapters mainly because this channel focuses on theological topics like theology proper, usually, and also because hopefully there'll be a discussion between you and Father Deacon Dr. Ananias on the 18th about epistemology and natural theology and a kind of an informal back and forth. So before anyone says that they're going to unsub because I'm having a sheikh on to explain Islam, I think one of the important things is that when we're learning about something, whether we're doing it for our own information in an academic sense, or if we want to critique a view for whatever reason, it's important to actually learn the theology from their own sources. And I think that Shaykh Asrar is a quite well-known traditional Sunni scholar when it comes to Kalam. He's specifically an Ash'ari. So I think that's why it's important to have this show. Plus, it gives I did an interview with Father Ananias, and I can do an interview with Sheikh, and then they can come together in a stream later down the road, and that way we get sort of a single take from both sides. Are you happy with that, Sheikh?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine.
So, I guess my first question would be, what was your main motivation for writing the book? Because it seems to me when I read it, there was a lot more of a kind of a defensive tone, insofar as it seemed like you were more trying to prevent Muslims from apostatizing to atheism and giving them a tool to answer atheist critics, rather than sort of going out to try to kind of convert or convince atheists of Islam, because only a small sliver of the book is actually about proofs for God. Could you comment on this and give an overview of why you wrote the book? What were your motivations?
So, the main motivation for actually writing the book was actually to inform atheists. So, in my interaction with atheists, I found that the atheists were quite ignorant regarding Islam, and their arguments were slanted. Many times they would state things which were totally incorrect. So the book was written with the prime purpose of informing atheists. So if an atheist does read the book, it does not necessarily convert an atheist to Islam, but what it does do is refine the atheists. So the atheists were totally unrefined in their response. You had even educated atheists like Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins making very ignorant arguments against Islam. So this book really informs atheists and it may convince a few atheists. It may even change someone's outlook and perceptions regarding Islam, regarding religion, regarding the very existence of Allah and the very existence of God Almighty, meaning how their perceptions of what they deem as a God. So I address some of the common absurdities that atheists bring up, like the spaghetti God in chapter 3, if you remember, and even the teapot analogy of Bertrand Russell, which is quoted quite oftenly, and but the argument in itself has no um, intellectual basis. So I really uncover those type of things. It also informs atheists with regard to Islam itself. So with regard to the Messenger of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and with regard to Sharia law, so the history of the Quran, the compilation of the Quran, the preservation of the Hadith and the Sunnah, and it even touches upon jurisprudence and fiqh towards the end, even though that was not the prime purpose of the book. So as you said rightly, I think the first 5 chapters were more thorough in terms of subject matter, because I cover also claims of scientific errors in the Quran, scientific errors in the Hadith. So if an atheist reads this book, he will be, or she will be, more well informed how to approach learned Muslims and not to make incorrect or fallacious arguments against Islam. The second motive for writing the book was to inform the Muslim public of many things which they would be uh, uninformed of or ignorant of. So this book actually becomes like a guidebook. There's a miscellany toward the end. A person can refer back to the chapters and look through the various subjects within the chapters. Chapter 4 covers evil and free will, and chapter 6 on Sharia law. Most questions which Muslims had related actually to Sharia law and the problem of evil, which is chapter 4 and chapter 6. And then I would say the scientific objections, which is chapter 5. So the first 3 chapters are more meaty in content, in the sense that a person would have to actually concentrate, especially chapter 2, as to what the author is attempting to convey. Chapter 2, a person would need to concentrate in order to grasp the concepts of chapter 2, especially what relates to epistemology. But the motive of writing the book was really to give clarity to any future debates or arguments. So even if I were to have a debate now in the future, in the near future, with an atheist, prior to the debate, I would send them a copy of the book. So they read the book and they do not make fallacious arguments or empty arguments or strawman arguments against Islam. And in fact, they strengthen their method of debating. The audio's not coming through.
Sorry,
Audio.
yeah, I muted
Yeah.
myself. My bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. Definitely, the first few chapters are much more meaty, which is why I find them particularly interesting. It seems kind of as one sort of big interconnected, whereas the other ones seem kind of separate and disparate and kind of goes all over the place. And not in a bad way. Yeah, but my question is, or well, it seems like you, as an Ash'ari, you kind of see Kalam as really, really, really bedrock, integral, and important for addressing atheism and for having a coherent kind of explanation of the world and God and all this. So in the first chapter, you emphasize the importance of Kalam in this way, and you even describe it as something that's like Kalam as a means for salvation. Could you explain what you mean by this and give a brief sort of history of Kalam from?
Yes. So chapter 1. Firstly, if you remember, the introduction was regarding the vitriolic toxic method of the new atheist, and I give a few examples of Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens. In fact, all the four horsemen, they like using biblical imagery, so they refer to themselves as the four horsemen. I refer to them and give examples of how they created a toxic environment post 9/11, and I give examples of Richard Dawkins' tweets and really inflammatory statements which generally are ascribed to religious people, meaning exhorting violence, for instance, ascribed to Christopher Hitchens, who was a proponent of the war, the invasion of Iraq, and other citations. Then I move into chapter 1. So chapter 1 is not as fiery as the introduction. So the introduction was written after the book. So the introduction may seem fiery, and some people may even think that the entire book will be in that exact mannerism. But each chapter qualifies as being a book. So chapter 1 is an introduction to Kalam and the importance of Kalam. In comparison to false arguments, media arguments, I give an example of the runaway girl in Saudi Arabia. She ran away from home. She suffered abuse at the hands of her father. And then the tabloid headlines picked up on that, and they associated that totally with Islam. So you have that method of argumentation, but then you have the most sophisticated counter of the Kalam methodology. So I'll go into what is Kalam. Kalam is the intellectual, theological method of a group of scholars who were known as mutakallimin, the theologians, who were at the vanguard of defending the creed of Islam and how this developed in the early centuries. So in the early centuries, the Muslims interacted with different religions, including Christianity, in Greater Syria, Egypt, in Alexandria, and other places. When they interacted with Christians, they interacted with Hellenistic philosophies, Greek philosophy. They interacted with various sects that arose during the Abbasi period after Greek philosophy was translated during the Abbasi Caliphate into the Arabic language, and this led to a clash between traditionalists and the various religions that still exist. Meaning some of these religions still exist in the Middle East, especially in Syria. You have so many different religions, and when they interacted with the Muslims had a response, or a theological response, a rational response to those religions, and this was the development of what is known as Kalam. So some say it's known as Kalam because of the amount of speech involved, the amount of talking that was involved. Kalam means speech. Others say that it was referred to as the science of Kalam because of the argument, the Christian argument, like the arguments of John of Damascus on the Kalam of Allah, which is the divine attribute of Allah, and the cross comparison of that with the Trinity. So that was one of the thorns of contention between Christians and Muslims, and that therefore the science became known as Ilm al-Kalam. Some have theorized as such, even though this is not actually proven. And then also the discussion of Sifat, the divine attributes of Allah, and the development of those arguments, and the clash between the Sunnis and the Mu'tazila. So in the early period, you had some Sunni ulama condemning Kalam, and what they meant by condemnation of Kalam was in fact the condemnation of the Mu'tazila. And this is in the 5th century. You had Ibn Asakir, who was a historian, and historian from Damascus. He's in fact buried today. His grave is still preserved on a roundabout. So if you go to Damascus, there's a graveyard known as Bab Saghir, which is an historical graveyard. Outside the graveyard, there is his grave is on a roundabout. So the government they had the construction of a road, and the grave is still on the roundabout. He wrote a book regarding Al-Imam Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari, and he states that the early condemnation of Kalam was in fact a condemnation of the Mu'tazila and deviant Kalam. So the traditional kalam was not in fact condemned. It was something that was actually necessary, that Muslims have a reasonable or rational arguments to counter any heresy. So that then in the book itself, I mentioned the historical role of kalam. If you remember, I mentioned the simplicity of the early generation. So I mentioned the examples and the stories of Sayyiduna Ali radiallahu an, how Sayyiduna Ali, the fourth caliph, and Sayyiduna Umar, the second caliph radiallahu an, how they would utilize their minds to to give arguments or responses, or their minds were what we refer to as safa'ul aql, which is clear minds, that they did not use sophisticated language in order to give their reasoning behind particular beliefs. But as the Muslims came in contact with various groups and civilizations, the arguments became more sophisticated, jargon, vernacular, certain types of words, which we have today, meaning when discussing with the Christians will have their own terminologies. Then the Muslims develop their own terminologies. And this is where certain overlapping, when you see overlaps, there is a lot of theorizing in academic works as to where certain concepts come from. So if you read, I think I once mentioned to you Wolfstein's book on the Kalam, the philosophy of the Kalam, which is now a really old book, written in the 1960s or something. You would find that he theorizes with regard to where did Muslims develop certain arguments. Now, that is just a short history of Kalam. There's more in the book, but then I move on to how Kalam is relevant to New Atheism. That Kalam has its history, but why is it relevant to New Atheism? Why it is relevant to New Atheism is because many of the arguments furnished by New Atheists were in fact. So what happened is I went to Wales, to the book village Heian Y, and I found a book by an atheist, Anthony Flew, who in fact became a deist before dying, but an old book written in the 1960s refuting theism and especially Christianity. I bought this book, I read the book cover to cover, I made my notes. This is how the development of the book came about in my mind. When I looked at some of the arguments of Anthony Flew, I found that many of these arguments, who was also a contemporary of C.S. Lewis, in fact, he was an eyewitness to some of the debates of C.S. Lewis in a university. But I noticed that many of those arguments were actually outdated arguments of the Mu'tazili sect. So the Mu'tazili sect from the first 200 years in the 2nd century of Islam, the Sunni ulama had already dealt with those arguments. But it seemed to me that Anthony Flew was unfamiliar with those arguments. So I saw it expedient that some of those counter refutations of the Sunni Kalam heritage or tradition be brought forward in the English language. So therefore the development of chapter 4. So many of these arguments had already been answered in the traditional Kalam works. And his entire work actually revolved around the problem of evil and the attributes of God. So the attributes of God is something that was debated in the past, and the books are filled with arguments and counter arguments, and similarly the problem of evil. The second aspect was since Kalam develops every century when clashing with different ideas, the ideas that we are clashing with today, like the scientific arguments against religion, evolutionary, Darwinian evolutionary theory, for instance, or the philosophical ideas, like the ideas of relating to morality, or the development of especially Western European philosophy against religion. So that this is where in chapter 1 I give the prime importance of Kalam today, that the Kalam methodology can still respond to these new ideas and new arguments also. So basically, chapter 1 is an introduction to Kalam and introducing the reader to the prime importance of Kalam in the modern times.
Yeah, my impression as well of reading a lot of the primary and secondary sources is that Asharism and Maturidism were kind of lumped into Kalam along with the Mu'tazili schools as well. And so they were considered, and it makes sense that you'd say that the condemnation of Kalam by certain early teachers was aimed at the Mu'tazilites rather than the other schools of Kalam. Is that something that I assume that's something that a lot of kind of Salafi like figures will try to use to kind of discredit the Kalam methodology. Is that right?
Yes, so there's works like Dhammul Kalam, which is the condemnation of Kalam, an early work which compiles all these condemnations of Kalam. Like Al Imam Shafi'i, radiallahu anh, he says, anyone who dabbles in Kalam, he should be lashed. These type of statements are found in the early period. But Ibn Asakir, who is a scholar of note and repute, even according to Salafi scholars or Salafi scholarship, Ibn Asakir is the author of Tarikh Damishq, which is the history of Damascus, a 100-volume book which is still published. Very renowned scholar of hadith. He has a chapter in his book Tabyinul Kadhib al-Muftari, in which he explains these statements and gives a historical context to those statements, stating that these statements were regarding the deviant ilmul kalam, which was the kalam of the Mu'tazili sect, and is not a reference to the Sunni theologians who are in fact defending Sunni creed at the forefront of defending the Sunni methodology.
Yeah, in a couple of my videos, I tend to see Kalam as sort of a means of a kind of a healthy development of doctrine. I don't know if you agree with me on that. What I mean is that you kind of get left with the Quran and the Sunnah. The scholars get sort of left the Quran and the Sunnah, much in the same way that the church fathers get left with the biblical text and the oral tradition and all the stuff that Orthodox would know about. And then it's a lot of it is a task of kind of precisifying and kind of rationally coming to conclusions about explaining the data that's in the Quran and in the Sunnah and in those sources. And so a lot of the more primitive, like you said, kind of early teachers might have been a lot more simplistic in their explanations because they didn't have some kind of figured out system to put everything together. So they were working with kind of like the crude oil, and then the Kalam kind of refining out the parts of it. Would you agree with that analysis? That's how I think of it.
There is some a caveat to that, which is that the early generations did start on a rational basis of believing in the Quran. This is something outlined by Al Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi, and Salafis take exception to this. The Sunni theologians state that the basis of accepting and adopting Islam, or adopting accepting the truthfulness of the Quran, it has a rational basis. So I also mentioned that in the book, that the onset is rationality, that we believe in the Quran and the Sunnah. But even though I do mention this varies from person to person. So if you remember in chapter 1, I give the example similitude of the Bedouin, the old woman, and then the sophisticated theologian and philosopher, to say that the Bedouin simply believes in God because he observes the camel leaving dung tracks, and he observes the dung tracks and he concludes there is a camel. And then he observes the mountains and the sea and the ocean and the deserts and the stars. He concludes there is a divine creator. That is a Kalami argument, but it will not be sufficient for someone trained in Oxford University in philosophy, or someone trained in science maybe. So the Kalam specialist, his task is to present an argument for those sophisticated minds also. And this varies from place and time. So even today, there are traditional ulama who still live in the deserts and they believe in the motionless earth, meaning they ascribe to the Greek model of the universe, because they do not interact and never come across modern civilization or modern folk who can inform them of Copernicus and Galileo. But when they do interact with those people, they would have to sophisticate themselves in understanding the developments of science. So likewise, when mutakallimin, who are always in the urban cities, meaning the populated cities, interacting with intellectuals, they must present sophisticated arguments to satisfy the doubts or to remove the doubts of those people. So this is a gist of chapter 1 and an introduction to that aspect.
Yeah, I think I like the like stylistically those kinds of examples, like the Bedouin example, for example, from the first chapter, because there's a lot of Christian books that do kind of a very similar thing to this, like Trent Horn's books or Ed Feser's books, off the top of my head. David Bentley Hart has a book as well. But what I like about this one is that it's unique in that it has a very it's written for a Muslim audience in parts, so it's got a very Islamic kind of flavor to it, and so you have those kind of interesting examples that come up. As a Christian, I've also experienced dealing with atheists. I was an atheist myself, but one of the things when I converted from atheism was I realized that a lot of the reasons I rejected religion was because of kind of straw men or fallacies. And in this first chapter, you list out about 15 fallacies that you give examples of the atheists make. I was wondering if you could name kind of like just your top 3, like you think the worst examples from an Islamic perspective. And
Yes, so referring to that particular segment of the book, that was actually developed from a Sheikh Abdul Rahman Hassan Habannaka's work. He has a work which is known as As-Sira' Ma'al Malahida, which is grappling with the atheist, and he presents some fallacies that they utilize, and that work is written in Arabic. So I adopted that as a framework and then added to the fallacies. I placed a few from myself and a few examples. One of the best ones was citation of unsubstantiated sources. So I gave that example because Peter Kreeft, the Catholic theologian from America, he has a book, Socratic Logic. So when I read that book, in that book he has an example of, he has a story of Sayyidina Umar having the library of Alexandria burnt down, or the contents. So he presents a story that when Amr ibn al-As conquered Egypt, they went into the library of Alexandria and he said, "Oh, we have all these volumes of books. What shall we do with these books?" And supposedly the Caliph Umar radiallahu anh said, these books, if they contain knowledge that is beneficial, then the Quran has all beneficial knowledge, so we do not need them. And if they have non-beneficial knowledge, then we do not need them. So burn them in the public baths. So burn them, to warm the water of the public baths. Supposedly this happened in the time of Umar radiallahu anh. And Peter Kreeft, surprisingly, accepts the narration, and he says words to the effect that Muhammad would have rejected this, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But the fact is that this narration was compiled 500 years after the Caliph Umar, in fact during the Crusader period, when Western Christianity invaded the Muslim parts of what is today modern Syria and Palestine. This was a concocted narration in an attempt to show backwardness of the Muslim civilization at that time. But the reason why I give that as a fallacy is to say that when an atheist presents a narration, he should always confirm and verify the narration. So this was one of my favorites in that list. Another favorite was the fallacy of presenting a position of a school of thought and stating that this is the position of Islam. So someone may find a position amongst Shia and say a particular position to object to, that look, you Muslims believe in this, but in reality that's a theological view of the Shia sect or of the Salafi sect or any other sects within the framework of Islam. Because within the framework of Islam, we will have sects, and then you have religions outside of the framework of Islam. So, like in Christianity, you would not deem Jehovah's Witnesses as being Christians. You would deem them as being a different religion. So, in Islam, Qadianis, for instance, would be deemed as a total different religion. But within the framework of Islam today, in the modern age, we would have three sects. You have Wahhabis with all their shades, or Salafis with their shades, and then Shia with all their various shades, and then you have Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, which is the Sunni orthodoxy. So presenting even within that framework a position of one of the groups and saying this is the de facto position of Islam is also a fallacy. Now, why this is important? Because this has no real link, and this is a common fallacy of atheists to present those things which have no real link to the existence of God, in terms of, like, for instance, Sharia law states this. But if Sharia law states this, this has no real link to whether God exists or not. And that in itself is a fallacy. So stating X, Y, or Z, but that there's no corollary between that and stating that God does not exist. So that was a third fallacy which I may have covered in that particular passage.
Yeah, I think one of the fallacies, like the first one you mentioned, is often the case with atheists when they say that the church sort of like suppressed science and stuff like that, which is just not historically true. And or like they always bring up the Galileo affair and massively overrepresent it. Like, you know, the historical analysis is just shocking sometimes. I suppose my one was it's kind of like a crackers in the pantries fallacy, where they'll ask for evidence for the existence of God, but then, you know, they have a very different notion of what constitutes valid evidence. A lot of them will kind of reject like syllogisms and arguments and that kind of thing, and just sometimes you can just ask them like, well, what would be a sufficient evidence for God's existence? And then they kind of short circuit, because they might say something like, oh, well, like a meteorite lands, or he comes and says something to me directly. But then you just sort of say the same thing to them when it comes to when you talk about any miracles, like historical stuff. They'll just say something like, oh, well, I was like, it was a hallucination or something, or I was hallucinating, you know. And it just, the bar of evidence just becomes so higher. And I find that to be quite a fallacy myself. And that was one of the things I had to come to realize when I was you know, becoming quite disillusioned with atheism. If you have any comments.
Yeah, so with what you mentioned, if they actually were fair and read some of the contributions of Christians towards science, even in the early 1900s, you've had many Christians who've contributed to science, and throughout the Middle Ages also. Yes, there are many things to be said with regard to the church and the role of the church, or persecution at various times, but that has happened even under certain Muslim rulers, like during the Abbasid rule, the persecution of Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal as an example. And in England, you've had the persecution of Sir Thomas More under Henry VIII. Thomas More was a Catholic, and Henry then established the English Church. So there's always or Samuel Beckett and persecution of pious Christians as well. So I think those arguments are in fact fallacies and divert the essence of the subject itself, which is, does God exist?
Yeah. So in your second chapter, this is really kind of probably the most technical chapter. It's a whole chapter on epistemology, and you really kind of go at lengths, really detailed lengths. I think probably the most detailed exposition of Kalam epistemology in one chapter that I've come across in English. Actually, I literally can't think of a better layout. To be honest, there's so little about the Kalam in English that I've come across, primary source wise and secondary source wise. Um, and you do this to kind of lay out how we know things, because it's a fundamental question, right? And it's a question that I think you and Father Ananias will enjoy having a discussion on. Could you explain or could you outline how the Kalam has traditionally defined knowledge and what the basic sources of knowledge are?
So if we summarize this in some of the classical works like Taftazani's commentary to Al-Aqaid, the summary of sources of knowledge, and then some of them expand into other types, which essentially are three, which is the sound senses, the five sound senses, the intellect, so the what we refer to as the judgment from the mind, without any reference to the external. And of course, philosophers up until recent history continue disputing this, whether we know things solely from the senses, even the judgments of the mind, are they from the senses? But in Islam, or Sunni theologians made a distinction: the knowledge attained from the five senses, and then that judgment which is specifically and solely from the mind, which David Hume will take exception to, which is discussed towards the end of the chapter and chapter 3. And then the third source of knowledge, which is known as tawatur, mass transmission, like we know Paris exists even though we've never been to Paris. How do we acquire the knowledge of the existence of Paris? So that falls under tawatur. These are the three foundational sources of knowledge. And then within those types, within those three categories, there are various types. So toward the middle of the chapter, I mentioned 6 types of certainties that we can reach. One is the syllogistic argument, but the syllogistic argument is from the mind, but can have a reference point to the external, to the senses, or to information that you've received. So there's when these three integrate, you can have 6 sources of knowledge. So that's what I cover at the beginning. The part which people find difficult to grasp is the part where I mention the judgments. So I mentioned the rational judgment, empirical judgment, the various types of judgments. But if you wanted to simplify the entire chapter, you can say simply knowledge has 3 sources: the 5 senses, the mind, like we know 2 and 2 is 4, we know that solely from the mind, and the tawatur, which is mass transmission. And then what David Hume would take exception to is he would say that what we refer to as a rational judgment is actually an organizing of ideas that we receive from the external senses. So he would say everything we know from in the mind is in fact taken from our sense experience. But I refute this by saying that there, and this is where even early literature like Al-Hayy bin Yaqzan, which was a story which inspired Robinson Crusoe, the book. It was inspired by Al-Hayy bin Yaqzan, a child born on an island with no to do with being stranded and having no sense experience of other things, but being able to form rational judgments. So the response to that would be, if someone's born blind and deaf, or someone's just born blind and they've never seen certain things, they still will be able to give you rational judgments, like 2 and 2 is 4, or something cannot be moving and still at the same time. So this shows that rational judgments are actually independent of sensory experience. So that's why I move on to Western philosophy towards the end of the chapter. If you notice, I give an overview. It's the idea is not to refute the philosophers at that point. The idea is to give us an idea of what are the foundational principal philosophies that are at the basis of modern new atheism. So if you remember, I mentioned a few of the Western philosophies towards the end.
Yeah, I remember reading Taftazani, and when he lays out the three sources of knowledge, the three basic sources of knowledge. And I was a little bit kind of, this goes in a lot more detail, your book does, than he does. But I was a little bit kind of confused, or I just thought it would be weird that he would include mass transmission as one of the sources of knowledge. But when I thought about it more, I realized that in modern epistemological terms, these three sources really are just so like intellect would be basically the a priori, a posteriori, and the synthetic, the analytic, basically kind of deductions. And then something like the sense data would basically be sense perception, right? Like epistemology of perception, like, and then mass transmission would basically just be the kind of a proto or an Islamic way of expressing what testimony is in modern epistemology. So,
Yes.
yeah. Do you want to say something? Sorry.
Yes. So what you mentioned about Taftazani and his simplification of the sources of knowledge, what I did is, if you refer to the bibliography, I mentioned some classic uh, Arabic Kalam works in the bibliography. So that the expansion on what Taftazani says, or what any of those early theologians say, is actually an extraction from those works and placing it in modern jargon, using modern examples for the modern mind, the English-speaking modern mind. And a new atheism is really an English-speaking phenomenon, that even if people are new atheists, but they are not English-speaking, the ideas are from the West. This is different to, for instance, Maoist communist atheists. Their approach to religion is totally different. We're discussing Western new atheism, which claims to be liberal, so the language needs to be adapted according to their mindset.
Excellent. So could you, because like you said, people get confused over the judgment thing. Could you explain to us what a judgment is, and give an outline of the systematic in the use of judgments and the different kinds of judgments in the epistemology of the Kalam?
Yes, so a judgment is defined as being an affirmative or negative statement between what they refer to as mawdu and mahmul. Mawdu is a subject, mahmul is what's ascribed to the subject. So if I say Zaid is standing, Zaid is the subject, standing is ascribed to Zaid. What I do then is I make a judgment by saying Zaid is standing. That's an affirmative statement. Likewise, if I say Zaid is not standing, that's also a judgment. So that's a judgment. But then judgments can only be deductively categorized into three categories. One is a legal judgment, which is not the subject of the book, because legal judgments relate to Sharia law, saying alcohol is prohibited, uh, uh, drugs are prohibited. This is a legal judgment, so it's not uh, the subject of the book. The rational judgment is a part of the subject of the book, and the empirical judgment, two judgments, which I mentioned. Now, rational judgment is from the mind. If I say 2 and 2 is 4, that's a rational judgment. But if an empirical judgment would be paper burns, meaning if we light a match on paper, paper is flammable. Paper is a flammable material. How do I know this? From sensory perception. So the judgments are in fact a subsidiary of what I mentioned as the sources of knowledge. So the judgment, the empirical judgment, is what we observe in the universe from experimentation. Science falls under this. And the rational judgment are the judgments which emanate solely from the mind. Even though, as I mentioned, some philosophers take exception to this. There is a natural clash between philosophers, but this is the position of the mutakallimin, the Muslim theologians, that they are two different judgments, the empirical and the rational. Now, why some readers may find the chapter to be too abstract is when I give the abstracted examples. If you remember when I say about the connection between things. For instance, I say food, the presence of food entails the absence of hunger, and the absence of food entails the presence of hunger. So that sounds too abstract, but it's not really important to, even if a person doesn't grasp that, the main thing is that they know that there are three sources of knowledge, which is the rational judgments, the empirical judgments, and tawatur, which is the mass transmission.
Excellent, thanks. You go into quite a lot of detail about different kinds of rational judgment as well. You talk about conceptual rational judgments, confirmatory ones, intuitive ones, intrinsically necessary ones, extrinsically necessary ones. Would you be able to talk about those a little bit?
Yes, so intrinsic, what that refers to is, for instance, extrinsically necessary would be a tree. A tree grows with roots, even though I've been told that there's a type of tree that has no roots. But let's say, for the most part, a tree grows without roots. If I say a tree has grown without roots, you would say that's impossible. So therefore, it's necessary for a tree to have roots. But how do you know this? Is it solely a rational judgment, or did you base that judgment on your sensory experience of observing all the trees through a deductive process? The answer is you know this through a deductive process, which is known as istiqra in Arabic, which is you go around and you investigate, and then you reach a conclusion that all trees grow with roots. So therefore, you give a rational judgment saying it's impossible for a tree to grow without roots. But that judgment is taken from your sensory experience. Therefore, it's extrinsically impossible. What that means, if God wanted, if God willed, he could create a tree without roots. While an intrinsically rational judgment, or something to be impossible, is without any reference to sensory experience. Like you know from the mind alone that something doesn't move and is not still alone at the same time, or 2 and 2 is 4. You do not need to know that through sensory experience. That's intrinsically necessary. 2 and 2 being 4 is intrinsically necessary. It's not extrinsically necessary. So that is a type of rational judgment. Is that the part you're referring to?
Yeah, because you go through a few of them, different kinds of rational judgments, and for me, I'm just trying to suss out, because it sounds to me like it really does sound to me like the rational judgments are basically a priori propositions, and then you kind of have synthetic and analytic ones. It sounds to me anyway. And so I just think it's interesting that there was this kind of stuff going on in the Kalam so early on that kind of gets fleshed out more later on by Kant and whatnot.
That's why I mentioned Immanuel Kant and Hume at the end, just as a point of interest, that the types of disputes that occurred amongst the Western philosophers at a later time.
Mm.
If you remember at the end of the chapter.
And then you basically go on to use these judgments that you make as an individual to kind of come to having proofs. Is that right?
Yes. So how we reach certainty with regard to anything would be based on one of these three methods or a combination of these methods.
So could you talk about the different categories of proofs that you outline?
Yes. So if I remember correctly, the 6 categories which I mentioned, actually these are taken from classical logic books which were written in the early period. Mutawatir is one, mass transmission. What you will notice about those 6 methods, they are either purely rational or purely to do with the sensory perception, or a combination of both. Or they have tawatur, which is mass transmission. And in one sense, mass transmission itself is a combination of both, because you only hear of the transmission from people. So it kind of falls under sensory perception also. So if you remind me the order I've given in the book, what is the order that I've mentioned in the book?
You've got fundamentals.
Yes, so
Those
so
are
fundamentals
axioms.
are, yeah. So the things that we know. The example I give is what in the book, 2
When
and 2.
you say 1 is half of 2, the whole of
Yeah,
something is larger than its part.
yeah.
An
So
object
the
can't be moving and
fundamentals,
still at the same time.
yeah.
Yeah.
So fundamentals impart knowledge for us. Then the next one,
You've got perceptible or observable phenomena.
yeah. So what we observe on a daily basis.
Yeah, the fire is burning would be an empirical judgment. And then, but you've also got another section called the empirical.
Yeah. So the difference between the two, one requires experimentation. So continuously doing something, we know the effects are a specific effect, and science falls under this. But then there are certain things which do not require repetition. Like if you know water is cold, this water is cold, you know that by touching water once, this water is cold. But there are certain things that would require experimentation, like paracetamol removes pain. How do we know? Through experimentation. So, people with pain, they take paracetamol and then the pain is removed, but they know this through experimentation. It's not known firsthand.
This might be a bit of a stretch question, but is that more to do with the fact that it's difficult? It's more difficult, like you have to use instruments to do that, or is it more because
Even human experience of certain things. So, taking medicines that remove symptomatic or symptoms, ailments, we know that through experimentation, not once or twice, a few times, and numerous people doing this, and then we know that this particular medicine has this particular effect.
yeah? So it's just kind of a limitation. It's just the reason why that is because it's a limitation. Is that correct? Or
Yes.
okay, because I mean I would say that paracetamol has like this intrinsic property of, dulling pain, right? So if you tested it once and it dulled pain, then I'm not.
Yes, we would say that
Yeah.
now, but in its initial stages, let's say before paracetamol was conceived, we would not know that paracetamol has this particular
Yeah.
effect. So it's not something that you would know like water is cold. It would
It's not
require,
something you can know through sense perception in the sense that it's not something you can you can't smell that or see that or taste that, is
yes,
it?
so it would require some people to test and experience that, and then we know it now firsthand. But even then, the basis of that knowledge is experimentation in its initial stages.
Right. And then you've got the intuitive. You've got one of the
Is it
categories.
the example is of the moon? So the phases of the moon. So the difference between first apprehension, quick apprehension, and what I refer to as intuitive is intuitive still requires a few steps of thought. So when I say 2 is half of 4, I know this intuitively also, but the difference between saying 2 is half of 4 and knowing that the light of the sun reflects onto the moon requires more steps of thinking.
Yeah, so it's more synthetic rather than analytic. Yeah.
Yes.
And then you've got mass transmission, and then you've got and I think that's probably, I imagine mass transmission was kind of the main, like there seems to be a specific approach to testimony, like epistemological testimony in Islam, insofar as because the tradition that the religion was originally started in an oral tradition, right? Is that why you think
It
it is?
also relates to what we refer to as mu'jiza, which is miracles. So the determination of miraculous events depends on tawatur. So certain miraculous events uh, which prove the truthfulness of prophethood hinge upon mass transmission.
Hmm.
Mass transmission is an essential source, as well as the transmission of the Quran depends on mass transmission of most of the hadith, many hadith. Not all hadith are mass transmitted, but they are still accepted. But mass transmission imparts absolute certainty. So it was essential. And that's interesting because David Hume, again, one of his arguments against miracles is based upon the veracity of the narrators of the miracles. He states, how do we know with absolute certainty that they observed those miracles? So tawatur relates to uh, those objections raised by David Hume also.
Okay. And then the last one is the rational propositions. And you talk about syllogisms here.
So yes, so those syllogisms which impart absolute certainty, they are based the content, what is referred to as madda, the content of the syllogism must be truthful for the outcome to be truthful. So if the content is not truthful, the syllogism is incorrect. So the content, for that to be truthful, it must be based on one of the previous 5 sources of knowledge.
Yeah.
And
So this
that's
is
why when you get a false syllogism, that false syllogism is always based upon false content. So if the content is truth, the syllogism is truthful. And the form of the syllogism also.
yeah,
How
valid
the
and sound distinction. Yeah, the content, if it's sound, you can have a valid syllogism that isn't sound, but to have the certainty, you need it to be both valid and sound, right?
yes,
Yeah, and this is where the Kalam cosmological argument would fit in, for example.
yes.
Okay. So, and then you have a big section on how love is a fallacy in this, and I quite enjoyed reading this. And it's by you pretty much just lift this from Max Schulman, who is an
Yeah.
American writer. I noticed the book is actually also littered with quotes from his name escapes me right now. The author for Sherlock Holmes books.
Conan Doyle.
That's it, Arthur Conan Doyle. Yeah. You seem to have quite an attunement with kind of Anglo-Saxon literature. Is that because of your upbringing? It seems to kind of come through that you really appreciate a lot of the Anglo-Saxon kind of heritage.
Well, just being a reader, from a young age, I've read huge amounts of English literature, but my upbringing, um, I wasn't really encouraged to do so at home, but I did it nevertheless. Perhaps due to being exposed to so many books in the home. So my father bought an encyclopedia when we were young for £100, and then I remember reading through the entire encyclopedia and then picking up on various English literature and acquiring that literature from the Bosleth Library, which is near my home.
Well, it looks like you even read the Catherine Tate's book about Bertrand Russell, which you put
In
at the end
fact,
of the book.
Bertrand Russell's own autobiography I picked up in 3 volumes and very patiently read through the entire book. Very interesting work. His maternal uncle was in fact a Muslim, which surprised me, and he had hearing problems. His uncle, and he states, "I never met a more boorish old man." He states that regarding his uncle. So I had a good read through the works of Bertrand Russell, David Hume, few of these English philosophers. Hume is actually Scottish.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So I mean, I may as well just say this is maybe this might feel a bit disjointed, but I think at some point you talk about taqlid, which is blind conformity. Could you explain a little bit what that is and why it's problematic? And could you also relate this to the issue of the Bedouin? I mean, when should the Bedouin, like when would a like say a Bedouin type individual or a grandma be in taqlid, and when would they not be? And do this
Yes,
obviously
so
gets into the issue of legal responsibility in that, but yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
the absolute condemnation of taqlid is with regard to uh, that those tenets of faith which are known in religion by necessity, so the very existence of God. But whenever a Muslim is confronted with a doubt, which is known as a shubha, an obscurity, which needs removal, then they refer to the experts if they are unable to remove that obscurity individually. That doesn't fall under blind conformity. It refers to fulfilling what the Quran states, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ ذِكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Go to the people of remembrance, which is the people of knowledge, if you do not have knowledge yourself regarding something. So, in the first steps taken by a Muslim is to know why God exists. But if they ever come across doubts, shubuhat, obscurities, which they themselves cannot counter, they cannot remove, then they must refer to the people of knowledge. Referring to the people of knowledge in this scenario is not deemed as blind conformity. Blind conformity is when a person believes without any fulfilling evidence or proof to satisfy their inner soul with regard to rationally with regard to the existence of Allah Almighty.
That's excellent, thank you. In terms of the sources for what Muslims have to believe, sort of namely what beliefs you'd have to hold, or you would be in kufr, or you'd be outside of Islam if you didn't believe those things, are sort of only kind of explicitly stated doctrines by the Prophet in the Sunnah and the Quran, uh, the only things you have to believe, or can the sort of the schools or the tradition and the Ummah come to a consensus on kind of other things, other theological beliefs about God, say like His nature, or the number of attributes, or those kinds of things? Is there anything like that?
So whatever is stated in the Quran and the Mutawatir Sunnah. So the Quran and the Mutawatir Sunnah, the Quran and the mass transmitted Sunnah is firstly known as Qati al-Thubut, which is decisively established. Then if the import of the text is decisive, meaning what it refers to, like God being one, God being eternal, that is known as Qati al-Dalala, which is decisive in its import, decisive in its signification. Those two things are known as ma'loom fi din bid darura, known in religion by necessity. If someone rejects that, they leave the fold of Islam. Like the Qadianis, they reject finality of prophethood. Finality of prophethood upon the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is decisively mentioned in the Quran. The Quran mentions that and is signified decisively. Therefore, that tenet is known as ma'loom fi din bid darura. Then after this, you have a third a category of beliefs which is known as ijma', consensus, which we would say ma'loom bid darura inda ahli sunnah, which is known by necessity by ahl sunnah. The ahl sunnah, when they agree, when they have consensus on those things which are other than ma'loom bid darura by necessity in religion, that is known as orthodoxy or Sunni orthodoxy. So if there is a group of Muslims, they deny the essential beliefs of Ahl Sunnah, they do not become disbelievers. They are still deemed as believers, but heterodox believers, meaning They believe in heterodox beliefs which go against the consensus. So the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah cannot have a consensus and then deem those who deny the consensus as being disbelievers. They deem them as heretics in the sense that they are sinful for adopting beliefs which contravene the ijma, the consensus. But what is known as consensus of the ummah is what is known as ma'loom fi din bid darura, tenets of faith which are known by certainty by all Muslims. Like I mentioned finality of prophethood. Another example is angels, the existence of angels. It's known by necessity. So irrelevant if someone is Shia or Sunni or Salafi, that is known by necessity. But once they reject a tenet known by necessity, then they are deemed as a different religion or a person who's left the fold of Islam.
So what about if there's kind of different views on something being shirk or not being shirk, right? Like, so what if there was an ijma, like a consensus of the Ahl Sunnah that a certain doctrinal view was ijma, was shirk, right? Because I ask about this because a lot of the Ash'ari and Maturidis that I've read have a discussion about kind of like libertarian free will, and that it would imply a kind of like shirk al asbab, they call it. I even saw Hamza Yusuf talking about this.
So
Yeah.
if they have no ijma amongst themselves on that particular point, then it's not deemed as ma'loom fi din bid darura if they dispute that point. So if the Ash'aris and Maturidis dispute a point, whether it's shirk or not, then it would not be deemed as shirk, but it can be deemed as bid'ah, innovation.
What if they agree on it though?
If they agree, then depending on the nature of the bid'ah, it will either fall into ma'lum fi din bi darura, known in religion by necessity, or ma'lum bi darura inda ahli sunnah, which is that ahli sunnah agree on this. Anyone who rejects this is a heretic in the sense that they are at the fold of Ahl Sunnah, but they are not. They are still a Muslim. So it'd be one of the two. And this is what distinction then the jurists make. Before declaring anyone a disbeliever, there's an entire process. Meaning someone is not deemed a disbeliever without the juristic method, which is the task of the muftis, which it falls under usul al-takfir, which is principles of anathematizing someone out the fold of Islam.
So there actually isn't so there isn't a like the Ahl Sunnah are not identical to the Muslims, right? Is that right? Like that you can be a Muslim without being Ahl Sunnah.
You can be a Muslim, like Shia are Muslims, but they are not Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah.
Okay. Sorry, could you also reiterate? So what exactly, where does, if it's not from ijma, then how is a decision reached on what
So the ijma would be
puts you
two
inside
types.
or outside of being a Muslim, I
So
guess?
you would have two types of ijma in this case. One ijma would be an ijma on those beliefs which I mentioned are qati al-dalala and qati al-thubut, which is decisively established and decisive in its import. And that ijma is the ijma of the entire ummah. Everyone agrees upon that. So anyone who goes against that would be deemed a disbeliever. Then there is ijma of Ahl Sunnah on those issues which are not necessarily qati al-dalala or qati al-thubut. They can be one of the two, but not both at the same time. Anyone who goes against this ijma would be termed as being a deviant, an heretic, but still a Muslim. But similar to, you would say, a sinful Muslim, but the sin is worse than a sin of action, like drinking alcohol, or the meaning the sin is severe, but they still will enter paradise from the 73 sects, according to one interpretation.
So there's kind of two grades of ijma then. My last question, just my last kind of off script question, because this is interesting to me. What is the source of ijma? For example, is it the scholars? Is it a particular grade of scholars who are Muslims who come to this consensus? And at what point does the consensus get like established? So let's say if 1,000 years from now there's a big change in the consensus over some issue, then could that over time become something that's, the first two ones you mentioned, right? So like I can't remember the Arabic words off the top of my head, but the
So
ones that don't put you outside of Islam, basically. Could there be
the first type of ijma is immutable once it's finalized. But who finalizes ijma? There's a group of scholars known as mujtahideen, which are not many in number every century. So in the time of the companions of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there were around 20 plus mujtahids. From 110,000 companions, only 20 or so mujtahideen. Then in the following centuries, a handful of mujtahideen in every century. When they have a consensus on a given matter, after they're passing away, if there is no objection to the consensus, then the consensus is finalized and it cannot be revoked or cancelled or abrogated by later generations.
Okay. That's good. Thank you for that. Thank you for that digression. So moving on. In chapter
I think
3,
atheists would have fallen asleep by now on those side discussions.
Yeah, sorry. I'm trying to make it theologically relevant because it's a Christian channel and we don't really deal with atheism. And your book is so unique that it just seems particularly it applies to so many areas, and I think theology is one of the big ones. So in chapter 3, you start to talk about Hume and some proofs for God's existence based in deduction. Like what import do you see with respect to Hume? How is he important?
Hume was the harbinger of modern skepticism. So, and I noticed this skepticism in many Western academic circles. They have a mitigated skepticism, where even if they have near certainty with regard to an aspect of belief, they will always leave some room for skepticism. And generally speaking, amongst Western academic circles also, and even though the Western academic circles and those who spring up from them, meaning in Pakistan, for instance, in Islamabad University, very much influenced by Western academia, they will always leave some room for skepticism. And that is rooted in David Hume's way of thinking. If we go back, so rather than reading about David Hume, what I did is I actually read his original works for this, prior to even conceiving that I will write a book on atheism, and then critiquing what he states with regard to skepticism. And if you notice the discussion in chapter 3, the beginning, I link it up with Taftazani's claims regarding the Greek skeptics, and then giving a time frame of how David Hume is linked to those Greek skeptics. What they state is he had read some of the works of the Greek skeptics and he formulated an entire method of thinking which was based upon those Greek skeptics. So it's important that David Hume be tackled in order to counter modern skepticism or a mitigated skepticism, even regarding what the existence of God, which we as theists say is what absolute certainty. You cannot have room for doubt. So it's important, essential that the end of chapter 3 mentions David Hume, and then the beginning of chapter 3 goes into David Hume at the beginning, going to countering his arguments for mitigated skepticism.
you do talk about the, like, you mentioned a few arguments for the existence of God. I was wondering kind of which you think is the most powerful or convincing argument, and your notion, your I don't know if it's just because I haven't read much Kalam where they kind of, I mean, the proofs of the existence of God tend to be quite laborious, and kind of about like movement and stuff. For example, contingency as well, like the contingency of like created objects and stuff like that. I was wondering what is your favorite argument, which do you think is the most powerful?
Many people I've interacted with, especially Muslims, they find the design argument the most compelling. So they mention everything in creation signifies a creator. So toward the end of the chapter, of chapter 3, if you remember, I mentioned so many, like I even mentioned the silkworm, how the silkworm weaves its silk, meaning some would see this as a sign of God. So signs of God are in everything in creation around us: order, the fine-tuned universe, the teleological argument, and whatnot. But my favorite part of chapter 3 are actually two things. One is the 7 principles. If you remember the 7 principles, I mentioned the 7 principles, by which Al-Imam Muhammad bin Yusuf as-Sunusi states, if someone memorizes these 7 principles, the 7 doors of hell are closed for him. So the 7 principles which link to the argument of contingency and movement. Yes, those 7 principles. So I present the 7 principles, and then I give the basis. So it's not a purely dogmatic method of presenting just 7 principles that you must accept these 7 principles. I also give the proof for the 7 principles, and that part was my favorite. The second part that I enjoyed writing was on the set theory, on Cantor's numbers and set theory, and with regard to eternality of numbers and the eternality of contingencies, and countering that argument. That was my favorite. A third part of the chapter which I enjoyed thoroughly, aside from refuting David Hume, countering Bertrand Russell, Richard Dawkins, and Lawrence Krauss. So the reference I make to Lawrence Krauss and the universe from nothing. And so patiently, you read the entire book of Lawrence Krauss, A Universe from Nothing, and then presenting the critique of the book in a few pages. Meaning a reader wouldn't realize how much effort is placed in that. You patiently read, like you said, a laborious reading of going through such a book full of fallacies and mistakes, and then presenting the holes within the book within a few pages. And so chapter 3 is actually one of my favorite chapters also.
So the 7 proofs are basically the impossibility of the contrary kind of proofs for God, right? So if you can prove that, say for example, um, the impossibility of contingents that have no first, right? So you'd make a kind of a chain argument, right? So there would have to be a first non-contingent.
Yes, so how the argument goes is every entity has something additional to it which is not a part of its essence. So like a planet that moves, movement is not essential to its essence. Therefore, movement is something additional to it. But that movement cannot transfer itself to another entity. So the movement of planet Pluto cannot move to Saturn. So the movement is unique to that entity. And then like this, the 7 principles apply to everything around us, by which we conclude that everything is contingent, and everything is which is contingent is in need of something which is eternal. So just to acknowledge that there is an eternal cause for the universe uh, is a major step and leap or a bound for an atheist to adopt. So the book can kind of convince a skeptic that there is a cause for the universe. But then what I do toward the end of the chapter is I place the divine attributes of God. And
Yeah.
why do I do this? Because to counter the fallacy of the atheists, where they say, "Oh, God could be a spaghetti god or a god with a beard and sitting on a throne." So, in fact, they are refuting the concepts that they have created within their own minds. So, I give the correct conceptual or the correct concept of God for the atheist, and this moves to chapter 4. Why does it move to chapter 4? Because if the atheist even accepts that there is a God with divine attributes, they object to him, meaning they object to his divine actions, which brings us to the problem of evil.
Yeah, so before we get to the problem of evil, you mentioned the attributes. That's a good segue. So, you seem to draw really heavily off of the Sanusi Creed, and I've read the book, and so I saw the correlation. Could you explain the interrelationship and the difference between kind of the names of Allah and the attributes of Allah in your view? Like, what are these distinct? What's the
So
yeah.
you have sifatul that, and you have sifatul fa'al. Or sifatul that is the attributes of the divine essence, and the divine attributes are endless. So even though the Ash'ari works list 20 attributes, the attributes of God are endless because God is eternal, therefore his attributes are eternal. But what is essential for every Muslim to know is 20 attributes. But then there are so many other attributes mentioned in the Quran and Sunnah that we affirm as qualitative attributes, ma'ani, qualities of God. But what is referred to as the names of God is sifatul fa'al, so the divine actions of God. So where when we see the effects of the divine action, so these are referred to as sifatul fa'al. So God is the one who gives death, so he is known as al-mumit. Death is an effect that we observe, that a human being dies. Who created death? God. Therefore, God is known as al-mumit. But we also see life and birth, so therefore God is also known as al-hayy, al-muhyi, the one who gives life, al-muhyi. And likewise, we see God raising people. He is known as al-rafi', the one who raises. But we see him lower people in status, so he is known as al-khafid, or he is the one who gives respect to people, so he's known as al-mu'izz. So, but he is also the one who people are placed in disgrace, so he is known as al-mudhil. These are known as sifatul af'al. And why I mention these at the end is because they relate to the problem of evil. Because we say these are attributes of God, meaning the names are attributes of God. Which type of attributes? The attributes that relate to his divine actions. But the other attributes are sifatul ma'ani, qualitative attributes, like God being all willing, God being all knowing, God being all powerful.
If I remember rightly, Sheikh Fuda or some of the other commentators in the Sanusi Creed seem to make it sound like, or even the Sanusi Creed itself. But I do remember reading that it sort of sounds like the names are kind of uh, like attributions that point to the sifat al ma'ana, like the essential and the qualitative attributes. So the names kind of just like you could have a number of names, but those names could refer to a particular attribute, right?
What those theologians state is that the sifatul af'al, uh, each sifatul fa'al can fall under an attribute of the other sifat, the 20 sifat. So like God creating death, God is known as al-mumit, the one who gives death. This also falls under the qudra of God, the divine power of God. And it also falls under the irada of God, the divine will of God. So that's what they mean. And likewise, you can say the names of God, like the 99 names, but there are more names. There are not just 99 names, there are more names. They signify the attributes, the divine attributes, which are not only 20, there are more. But then the divine attributes signify the that, the aseity of God, the very essence of God.
Okay. All right. Moving on. In chapter 4, you start to address the problem of evil. Could you explain to us the notion of legal responsibility? Because this was something that I learned from your book, and I thought it was interesting, and how it's important in the context of the problem of evil. And then could you just go over your approach to the problem of evil, or the Ash'ari approach?
So the problem of evil, why I started this with taklif is because taklif is those who are legally responsible, answerable to God. So I go through if you remember, I went through 10 conditions of taklif, 10 conditions, one of them being the mind, having sanity and the mind, and then age. Age is important. So in Islamic theology, all the correct position is all young children shall go paradise, to heaven. So unlike, I've been told that the Catholic position is that unless a child has been baptized, they can potentially go to perdition, or you would correct me on this if they hold that position or not. But nevertheless,
There's been debates
whatever,
on it.
yeah. So whatever the case is in Islam, but you can say by near consensus, but there is a dispute amongst some theologians that all children are to go paradise. In fact, the Prophet, peace be upon him, when he went to the ascension, he saw the children of the non-Muslims surrounding Ibrahim alayhi salam, and meaning the children of the non-Muslims surrounding Ibrahim alayhi salam, which is interesting. So children are exempt from taklif, and the list goes on. Now, the reason for mentioning this, rather than going into the theology of this with you, the reason for going into this with the atheists is because the fallacy of Richard Dawkins' arguments is based upon not knowing this essential aspect of Islam. For instance, Richard Dawkins states that he does not believe children should be labeled as Christian children or Muslim children. This is addressed in the book. And then he claims that religious people brainwash their children. So there's brainwashing, indoctrination of young children. So this has to be countered. So there's the reason for giving the 10 reasons for taklif. It really counters any claims made by atheists. Like they will pose questions which they deem are impossible for Muslims to answer, like saying, oh, let's say there is an Eskimo who lives in the North Pole and he never hears about the Quran. Do you believe he will go to hell? Well, the answer is no, because the message of Islam never reached him. So the purpose of mentioning the 10 conditions of taklif is because when a person learns these conditions, many of the later arguments are actually you will realize that the questions are actually flawed.
So when it comes to answering the idea that if God is able to prevent evil, like why doesn't he? What is the role of or purpose of evil, of the existence of evil in the Islamic view, basically?
So you missed out that the chapter starts with Stephen Fry. So Stephen Fry, and he's when he was on Irish TV, and Ireland is the wrong place for him to have done this, because Ireland actually has a higher concentration of Christians than the UK. He objects to God and refers to God as the fallacy in his argument is that God is wholly good, wholly with the WH, wholly good, and God is perfect, and therefore God creating evil would entail that God is an evil being. And he states if he met God, he would object to him. But why that is a fallacy? Because this relates to the attributes in Islam. God's divine actions are described, meaning God is the one who, like in the Quran, Allah states, وَهُوَ الَّذِي أَضْحَكَ وَأَبْكَى. He's the one who made people laugh, and he is the one who makes people cry. So God making people cry, he's told us that's his divine action. So then a discussion which I've not covered in depth in the book relates to the distinction between the arguments presented by Ibn Qayyim, the student of Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Qayyim, and the Ash'ari. The Ash'aris, they say God's divine actions do not necessarily always have a wisdom. Because God is fa'alul lima yurid. Ibn Qayyim takes exception to this. He says every divine action must have a divine wisdom. But the Quran states fa'alul lima yurid, the do of what he wills. But nevertheless, the Ash'aris do not deny that the divine actions do have wisdom. But they say it's not necessary.
This is an Ash'ari Maturidi dispute as well, isn't it?
Yes, right. So it doesn't relate to an issue of consensus. But within the book, I cover the mukallaf for a reason, who is tasked to believe. But then I go on to more difficult questions. Why did God even create us at all? And why does God need our worship? But the need our worship is a loaded question, because God has no needs. The correct question should be, why does God command us to worship him? And then eternal punishment in hellfire, the eternality of hell. And then I cover the wisdom, the free will, the human free will, and also the wisdom behind creating evil, meaning what are the many wisdoms, and the imperfect world. That God created three worlds. One is the perfect world, which is paradise. Then you have hell, which is filled with pure punishments. And then you have the middle world, which is our world, which has imperfections and perfections, both, a combination of both. But so I answer some of the wisdoms as to why the world is the way it is.
Yeah. On pages 173 to 174, you talk about acquisition, or like iktisab, and how God is the creator of our actions, and this probably has to do with God being the creator of evil. Which you characterize this as compatibilism and soft determinism. Do you see this as being this doctrine of acquisition as integral to the way of addressing the problem of evil?
So what I mentioned in the book is, after giving a thorough explanation to the belief of free will, I say some words to the effect that some may deem the Muslim or the Ash'ari position as soft determinism or compatibilism. But why that's integral to understand, to respond to the problem of evil, is because then the questions that arise, like why did God create, why does God punish us for actions that we are not responsible if we have no free will? And then the opposite extreme, that we have absolute free will without God creating anything, therefore God is powerless. I mean, there's two extremes. One is the extreme of the Jabariya, who believed God compels us to do everything, and we have no free will, no volition of our own. And the other extreme of the Mu'tazila, who believed we not only have our own free will, we also create our own actions. So that was another extreme of the Mu'tazila. The Ahl Sunnah took the middle way. They said we have an inbuilt free will, but God then creates the actions. And it does relate to the problem of evil, because this problem of evil was one of the main reasons why the Mu'tazila adopted many of their views, many of their positions relating to free will and God's grace and punishment, those positions were taken. When you study those positions, you will realize that they adopted those positions in order to respond to atheist arguments from that period of time.
Great. You also talk a bit about the Euthyphro dilemma. Could you outline for us what the Euthyphro dilemma is? I know because I read Plato's dialogues recently, but could you outline what it is and
So
what the
it was actually his question to Plato in the dialogue, and with regard to the essential nature of things, are things evil in of themselves, or are they determined by God? Even though he doesn't use that language.
Yeah, it's Socrates goes up to some official, I can't remember his name, and then starts asking him questions about he's some like trial. It's to do with some trial, I think. And then he asked him like, are people pious because they're loved by the gods, or are they loved by the gods because they're pious? And like,
Yes.
what is the
So what
yeah,
spirals from that is the question which the Mu'tazila brought forward, which was, are things evil in their essential nature, or are they evil because God determines them to be evil? And then the question also of good and bad, how are things determined to be good and bad? And then another question, which is the mind sufficient in uncovering good and bad? So the Sunni position, the Ash'ari position, is God is the one who determines things to be good and bad. And God is the one who, and then the Ash'ari position is, we can only know the badness of something or the goodness of something by the revelation, while the Maturidis say it
yeah,
can be uncovered with the intellect at times. And
yeah,
the Mu'tazila, on the other hand, they say things are only determined to be good or bad by the mind. So this undermines the power of God, because then that would mean God is dictated to by the mind, when the
right.
reality is God is the one who creates the mind and creates things to be as they are.
Okay, okay. Um,
And why that's important is
yeah,
because it relates to the problem of evil, of me mentioning evil is relative. So evil in itself is relative. I give the example of a snake. The poison of a snake is evil for the victim, but it's good for the snake. And this is actually developed from the idea of Al-Imam al-Ghazali in his book Al-Iqtisad, where he mentions this example.
hmm. I look forward to seeing certain comments to see what they think of this the problem of evil section in particular. Um, but so basically, when I asked why on the Islamic view does sort of evil and imperfections, those kinds of things exist, you would say that it it's purely by the will of God, and there is some kind of wisdom behind it, and you speculate on that in the book. Could you talk a bit about that?
That that would be the summary of the entire discussion, that these are
Yeah.
divine creations of God, and then I give citations of certain examples of what the divine wisdom is behind those actions. But I uh, placed specific emphasis on the most difficult questions, which is eternal punishment in hell, which was actually posed to me by a particular person who was affected by atheism and this particular objection, eternal punishment. And even after the book, one of those people brought to me additional counter arguments, which I did respond to them in person. So the reason for placing uh, those specific examples is to answer the most difficult questions relating to what is evil. So God punishing people for eternality, is it evil? Evil itself is relative. So God's actions, can they actually be described as evil? The answer is no. God's
Mm,
actions cannot, because again, going back to Anthony Flew refers to God as uh, a cosmic dictator, a cosmic Saddam Hussein.
mm,
Now that is again a fallacy, because uh, likening God to a cosmic dictator or to Saddam Hussein is a fallacy, because God is not a president that we vote in to power, or a dictator that comes into power and then who must abide by our rules. So the specific examples within the entire chapter are to tackle the most difficult questions relating to evil. Then towards the end, I give some wisdom with regard to why we experience death on earth, why we experience illnesses and disasters and pestilence and all these things.
This is an on script. It's a bit of a stretch question. If per the answer to Euthyphro that God sort of is the one who determines good and evil, why wouldn't God have just determined that there be no evil, and then humans would all just be good, and then there would be no hellfire? There would just, yeah. What would be your take on that?
So again, the very purpose of life is mentioned in the Quran as linabluwakum. We created you linabluwakum, in order to place you through this. This word nabluwakum, the verb, is from bala, to place you under this duress and this test of our worldly life. So to sift through those who are suitable for paradise and those who are suitable for hellfire. So that just relates to the divine will. But can God create a universe that in itself is better than the universe at hand? This was a question, which meaning the type of universe you are questioning is, can God create a universe in which there is no evil and then everyone goes to paradise? Is that better than what we have now? The answer is no. And this is what Al-Ghazali said when لَيْسَ فِي الْإِمْكَانِ أَبْدَعُ مِمَّا كَانَ. There is nothing better in possibility than what there is. So people took objection to this, to Ghazali. They said, God can create a better universe. Why do you say this? But the response is, what he means, because God has willed this particular life and this particular world, therefore this is the best, because it relates to God's will. So that is insufficient for an atheist, because they would say it relates to God's will, but we don't accept God's will. But then this is why I mentioned the concept of servitude to God. So the creation is two types: those who realize their innate ubudiyya, servitude to God, and those who do not, who reject. And then what does that mean? That means that every human being has been created with an innate neediness for his creator. Does he accept this neediness, or does he cover the neediness? If he accepts, he is what? An abd, servant of God. If he rejects, then he is what? A kafir, the one who covers the innate neediness to God. So this is why I make, if you remember in the chapter I placed, the worshipper who worships God for 500 years, I mention examples of servitude to God, that the distinction between a kafir and a believer is that the one who acknowledges his neediness is a believer, and the one who does not is a disbeliever. So the answer to your question, which is, can God create a world in which there is no evil and people just go to paradise? The answer is yes. But what we have is better. Why? Because it relates to the will of God. Why should we accept the will of God? Because the servant, the true servitude, the person who has realized his servitude, accepts whatever is the will of God. And this emanates from love for God also, which I do not cover too much of the aspect of love for God.
Great, thank you for answering that. You see the Sharia as kind of a cure to a lot of the problems in, like, evil in the world and the imperfections. Could you go into that a little bit?
So the Sharia is something that's that doesn't get good press in today's day and age in the medium, because of the bad representatives of those who claim to implement the Sharia. But the Sharia law, the end chapter, the 6th chapter, aside from covering the preservation of the Quran and Sunnah, it covers objections, atheist objections to the Sharia. Atheist objections to the Sharia. So the implementation of Sharia in the Muslim majority world, I don't cover as to with regard to how it's a cure for the ailments of the modern world, but I will give one example: is the banning of interest, usury, the harms interest cause, interest-based banking, interest-based loans, IMF loans, World Bank loans to what they refer to as third world countries, developing countries. In reality, the abused world, which is Africa and the rest of the South. So we have the high-tech North, Europe and Russia and North America, and then you have the South. Anything below the equator, you will notice is underdeveloped and abused. But the IMF loans is an example of how South America, because of the heavy loans and the interest-based banking, is the South Americans feel the need to cut down the rainforest to pay for, meaning to live a capitalist lifestyle, which affects everyone. So the lungs of the world affect the air that we breathe. This is just one legislation of Sharia, that the outlawing and the banning of interest-based banking, for instance, usually should be banned internationally. But if it cannot be banned internationally, then Muslim majority countries should ban interest and usury in all transactions. So this is one example. Second example, the banning of intoxicants, alcohol, and the drugs cartels, banning everything from marijuana, which is not used for medicinal use, exception being medicinal use, but marijuana for recreation and intoxicants. How many murders would not happen if people were not intoxicated when they carry out those acts? Similarly, adultery or murders which occur due to adultery, or people committing adultery, and then murders which occur as a consequence of that. So a banning of adultery. So these are cures from the Sharia, which of course is a total different discussion regarding Sharia law. But I'll cover some of these aspects towards the end, because Sharia law gets a bad press in today's day and age. And but I believe Orthodox Christians can relate to a lot of aspects of Sharia law, even though they won't agree with many things. There are aspects of Sharia law which even Orthodox Christians would agree with.
Thanks. I think we're just about coming to the end now. This final question is just something that I wanted to learn about, and it still touches on the ijma question from earlier. With respect to Islamic doctrine of God, like that you covered, you talked about the 20 attributes and the names and all this stuff, and uh, the notion of his oneness and his eternality and all these attributes and the attributes of essence, and then also iktisab, like how he acts and how he determines what's good and evil. What of in terms of those beliefs, those metaphysical beliefs about God and how he interacts with the world, like who is qualified to sort of make a decision on what's acceptable, make a legal, perhaps a legal judgment on what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, part of tradition. So let's say if a Muslim layman who had some kind of, he's doing theology at university or something, and he finds a particular Christian explanation of God or a particular explanation of something very convincing, but it's not in the Islamic tradition. Would it be valid for him to import that? And on what basis could he say that it's sort of like legitimate Islam, I guess?
The scale of measuring such things would be, again, a reference to the ijma. So if there's ijma on something known in religion by necessity, you have two things. One is the actual tenet, and then you have that which contradicts the tenet. So we believe God is one. So if someone believes in a multiplicity of gods, that's a contradiction of that tenet. So that is referred to as kufr. So if this explanation contradicts a tenet which is known by necessity, then it's kufr. If it contradicts something which is known by necessity according to Sunni Muslims, then it's known as a heresy. But if it doesn't contradict either one, then Muslims can adopt a certain form of argumentation with regard to whatever they may, because al-hikmatu dalatul mu'min, wisdom is the lost property of the believer. He picks it up wherever he finds it. So you would have three categories: an idea or a way, a concept, a schema of understanding something which contradicts that which is known in religion by necessity, that would be rejected as kufr. A schema which contradicts that which is known by necessity with Ahl Sunnah, that would be deemed as a heresy. And a third category, a neutral zone, that it can be adopted, and then an evolutionary process takes place where the Muslims adopt the idea and they develop the idea also.
What would be the kind of sources one would go to find out what the Sunnah and the Islamic ijma is on those metaphysical doctrines, would you say?
Again, the reference is made to the books of Aqeedah, but even a simple book of Aqeedah like the Aqeedah Tahawiyah, small text, even that's sufficient for a person to know what is agreed upon.
Okay. Okie dokie. But yeah, if you want more detail, you have to go into the bigger Aqeedah text, right, and the explanations of the theologians. Got it. Well, thank you so much, Shaykh Asrar, for coming on. I highly recommend this book if you're an atheist who wants to have an Islamic approach to the problems that atheists bring up contemporarily, and if you want to learn Islamic theology. So that's why partially why I brought it up on thought to do this interview on stream. Is there anything else you'd like to say? Maybe you could give us a brief overview of what the last chapters are, and yeah.
The last chapter 5 is on scientific science and Islam, which will interest many people. Chapter 5. Chapter 6 is on the Quran, Sunnah, and even the person of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and objections on the Sharia law. So anyone interested, they can even read through specific chapters of the book.
Yeah, they're quite well organized. I think you can't really read the first 4 separate from each other, but the last ones you can read individually, I think.
That's correct, yes.
So yeah, excellent. It's also a really nice book. Like, I think most of my hardback books in my room are Islamic books because they just love hardback books for some reason. And it's a very nice design as well. Is that it's like London, but it's like, you know.
So the top of the cover represents the intellectual and artistic heritage of Islam. And in fact, the dome has a verse of the Quran relating to disbelievers from Nuh alayhi salam, Noah. And the bottom part represents the dystopia which atheism will create.
Yes, that's what I thought too.
So the moral relativism of atheism, the moral relativism of atheism is represented by the bottom. I actually wanted a silhouette of Sancho Panza and Don Quixote going through the ruins of London, but then I disagreed with the artist on this point, so we didn't put that silhouette in.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for coming on, Sheikh. It was really interesting. It was nice to hear your thoughts and to hear your expansion on some of the concepts in the book.
No problem, and we'll be seeing each other soon, inshallah.
Yes, hopefully we'll see each other again soon, because I have a video on how I visited you in Birmingham and went to see the mosque and stuff. So I'd like to see you again soon, hopefully, inshallah. So yeah, have a wonderful evening.
Likewise.
Yeah.